I had a very San Francisco moment this morning. I went to the business center here at the hotel to print out my speech, and when I was printing it out, it said 14 pages, $26. And I wondered, is this some kind of artisanal farm-to-table paper that you now use in San Francisco? Are you guys so completely digital now that paper has become a kind of specialty niche product? Anyway, I've never felt more like an East Coast guy than at that moment. So I wanted to talk about the idea of transformation. What does it mean to reinvent a business, which is what all of you are doing, right? You're basically starting over, and you're reimagining what it means to have a relationship with customers and to sell software. And I thought what I would do is talk about that process. And I don't want to dwell on software and customer success specifically because I don't know anything about it. You all know more than I do, and why would I talk about something that you know more about than I do? I actually had a very humiliating experience on this very score not long ago. I was giving a talk. Do you know what Rockefeller University is? It's this all-star graduate school in New York. Everyone on the staff is basically a Nobel Prize winner. And they have this public lecture every now and again where they bring lambs in for the slaughter. And I was a lamb, and I was giving this talk, and I foolishly, midway through the talk, mentioned some obscure missile from the 1950s. And there's this guy in the front row, like white hair, still with the German accent. And he puts his hand up at the end and he goes, "With respect to the missile that you mentioned, you are 100% incorrect. I know this because I invented the missile." So I'm just not going to talk about software because someone in the front row is going to raise their hand, and you never really recover from experience like that. So what I thought I'd do is give you examples of other industries, professions that have gone through a similar kind of transition, and see if we can't pull out some lessons that I think will be useful for all of you as you go through this process. And the first one, I'll tell you 3 stories. And the first is about something that happened almost 100 years ago. In 1921 in Jersey City, there was a prize fight. And it was between 2 of the great heavyweight boxers of that era, a Frenchman named Georges Carpentier and Jack Dempsey, maybe one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. And this was a huge deal. I know they always talk about heavyweight fights as the fight of the century. This was the fight of the century. You cannot imagine the kind of excitement that was going on around the world about this prize fight. Boxing was at the height of its popularity. There were 90,000 people bought tickets for this boxing match. The purse was $1.7 million, which in 1921 dollars is a huge sum of money. And their reporters come from every single newspaper from around. I mean, I can't tell you, this was the sporting event of the year. And at the time, there was a young man named David Sarnoff who worked for a company called RCA. And RCA was then the nation's largest manufacturer of radio sets. And radio was in its infancy then, but it worked. You could buy a radio set and there was programming. There was classical music and there was news. But the industry was really struggling. And it was struggling because no one was buying radios. So Sarnoff is this young guy. He's working for RCA, and he goes to his bosses and he says, "Look, I've got this great idea. Let's broadcast the boxing event live." Now, no one had ever done this before. There'd never been a live broadcast of a sporting event before. It's a wholly new idea. And Sarnoff is just jumping up and down with enthusiasm, and he goes to the board of RCA, which is all of these guys with long gray beards, white beards. On the East Coast, older people are involved in business. I don't know if you know this, but it's possible to be over 50 and play a meaningful role in the American economy, but only if you're on the East Coast. So he gives this whole plan, and they look at him and they say, "That is the stupidest idea we've ever heard." But he's really, really emphatic, and he goes back the next day and the next day and the next day, and finally, just to shut him up, they say, all right, you can do it, but you're on your own. So he goes and he realizes he needs a radio transmitter. So he basically actually steals one from this army base nearby. Not the first time, by the way, something has been stolen in Jersey City. And then he realizes he needs someone to be the announcer. And there's never been a live broadcast before. He needs a so he has to find someone to be the first play-by-play person. And he finds someone who knows about boxing. And then he goes to the sales staff of RCA and he says, look, I need you to put up radios in bars and union halls and cafeterias and restaurants. Wherever there are people, there's got to be a radio on the wall so they can listen to what's going on. So he cobbles all this thing together and he puts together this makeshift broadcast booth in Jersey City. And on the night of this prize fight, he broadcasts the first broadcast of a major sporting event in American history. And in the days that follow and weeks that follow, an extraordinary thing happens, and that is that radio takes off. It goes from this technology that people were not terribly interested in into the dominant media force that it continues to be to this day. Right? He transforms that industry. He takes it from a place that was way down here to this extraordinarily important media presence in the United States. Now, why does he succeed at doing that? What's going on with that? What's so special about that broadcast that allows it to serve as the catalyst for this transformation of the world of radio? Well, the answer is that he reframes how customers thought about this technology. Right? If you talk to an American in 1920 about what they thought radio was, they would say, well, radio is a very expensive box, and it was a huge box. It was, it's probably this high and this big back then. It's a very expensive box that allows me to listen to the news. And if you talk to an American in 1920, the last thing they needed was another way of getting the news. The country was inundated with news. Each major city in this country probably had 7 or 8 newspapers. Morning newspapers, mid-morning newspapers, news. I mean, you cannot imagine kids on every street corner with a new edition every couple of hours. Americans were overwhelmed with news, and it was really cheap, right? So RCA was saying to Americans, I know you're obsessed with news, but I have a really great idea. I have a very, very expensive large box, which is going to sit in the corner of your living room, which is going to give you more news, right? People were like, why do I need that? Totally uninterested in it. And then Sarnoff comes along and he says, this box is not about the news. Right? It's about an experience. It's about being able to participate in the most crucial, the most interesting, the most hyped sporting event of the year without leaving your house. And the minute he says that, a light bulb goes on in people's heads. And they say, oh, I get it now. This is something that I want. And that is the dawn of the radio age. Now, that's a crucial insight because when you look at almost any kind of transformation of any reinvention of any industry, you will invariably find at the beginning of that process of reinvention this act of reframing, this moment when the nature of the issue or the problem facing the customer is reconceptualized, put into a form that allows them to completely reimagine and re-understand their relationship to the person trying to sell them the product. Now, that's what you're doing. Everyone in this room is engaged in that very same act of reframing, going to the kinds of people who use software services and say, you've been thinking about it like this over here, now we're going to think about it like that over here, right? And that is not a trivial transformation. Reframing, when it happens, is enormously significant and enormously difficult, right? It is something with enormous payoffs, but it's not easy. And so what I thought I would do is to talk about what those difficulties are. What is it about reframing that has proven so challenging for the industries that have gone through it? And there are 2 examples I want to give you. First is from involves a man named Malcolm McLean. really wonderful name that I have. And Malcolm McLean is someone who ought to be one of the most famous figures in the 20th century, but for some strange reason is not. He was born in 1913 in North Carolina, a little town called Maxton in the southeastern corner, really, really poor, rural part of North Carolina. And he grows up during the Depression, comes out of high school in the early 30s. Only job he can get is stocking shelves in a grocery store. And from there he goes and he gets a job at a gas station. And he learns that the owner of the gas station is paying a trucker $5 to bring in heating oil from Fayetteville, North Carolina. And he says to his boss, "I'll do that." And his boss says, "Okay." So he takes over that particular trucking route. And within a year, he has 2 trucks, and he's leased a tractor-trailer. By the end of the First World War, he has 162 trucks. And by the 1950s, middle of the 1950s, he has 1,776 trucks and the largest trucking company in the South. He is this classic Scots-Irish, long nose, no emotions kind of guy, but he is insanely focused and insanely ambitious. He's the guy who, his friends used to always say, he could never sit still for more than 5 minutes. You would go quail hunting with him, and he would immediately bet on who's going to shoot the first bird, who's going to shoot the most birds, who's going to shoot the biggest bird, right? He's that kind of guy. I am quite sure there is that kind of guy in this room as well. But the most important moment in his life comes in the mid-30s when he's still driving his own trucks. And he's driving a load of cotton bales from Fayetteville to the port in Hoboken, New Jersey. And he sits there, and it takes them a full day to unload his truck. And he goes crazy. He's a guy who can't sit still for more than 5 minutes. He said, "This is the biggest waste of time and money I've ever seen. How stupid is this, that I'm sitting here in my truck for 12 hours waiting for these guys to unload it?" And the frustration he felt was something that was actually very common in America at that time. The great choke point in the American economy up through the 1950s were ports, right? Ports operated up through the middle of the last century exactly the same way they had operated for 2,000 years. You drove up with a load of stuff. It was unpacked from your truck or your rail in pieces. Each piece was entered into a log, stored in a warehouse, and then loaded by hand back onto a ship, right? That process took forever. It took so long that routinely a ship would spend it took as long to load and unload a ship in America and in Europe as it took to sail between America and Europe. Right? When if you looked at the cost of shipping, the cost of moving something from America to Europe, half of it was just the unloading and unloading at the dock. Right? Not only that, the mob controlled all the docks. There was incredible corruption and theft. It was just a nightmare. It was so expensive and so time-consuming and so risky that most companies in America didn't even bother trying to export stuff. I mean, this notion that you would think about an overseas market for a product automatically is a modern invention. It was not the case in the 40s. Only incredibly expensive things could pay the cost of being exported overseas. So McLean thinks about this for 20 years, until finally in the 50s, when he's a very successful trucker, he can do something about it. And he goes out and he buys a fleet of ships, mortgages himself to the hilt. And his initial idea is, what he wants to do is he wants to do trade up and down the east coast of the United States. He's just going to drive his trucks onto the ship, sail the ship down to wherever, from Newark to Houston, and drive the trucks off. And then he realizes that's dumb. Trucks are really heavy, they take up a lot of space, and they'll be idle when they're on the ship. He can't use them. So he has a better idea, and that is he'll make the container on the back of the truck, he'll make it so you can take it off the frame and make the frame separate from the container. So he comes up with this new system of doing it, and he puts special slots in the ships, and he lifts the container off and slides it into the ship. And in 1956, the first container ship in America sails from Newark to Houston, called the Ideal X. And they do the math on it, and he has cut the cost of moving freight from $5.58 a ton to 15 cents a ton. And he has loaded a ship in 8 hours, which is something like 5 times faster than anybody else was doing it. And he flies down to Houston with his team, and they see the Ideal X sailing up the channel, and he bursts into tears. This Scots-Irish guy who has no emotions. Actually, because he thinks he has reinvented shipping, and he has, right? That's one of the most significant moments in 20th century commerce. The world was never the same. Without container ships, China does not rise to be a world power, nor does South Korea. Without container ships, there's no BMW plants in South Carolina. I mean, I could go on and on and on. This guy is on a par with the inventors of the steam engine, right, in terms of his impact on the world. He reimagines what it means to move something from A to B. Right? Now, what's interesting about that is, what's fascinating about that particular story is what a shift in power that represents. If you go back to Sarnoff for a moment, when Sarnoff reimagines the radio business, that has extraordinary implications for the power structure within radio. RCA was a device manufacturer. They made sets. They ran the show. The guys who built these things were the guys who ran the company. When Sarnoff comes along and suggests to them that they ought to be actually in the business of providing a service, of providing entertainment, software, what he does is he completely upends the balance of power in that company, and he forms a division of RCA called NBC, right? And RCA is long forgotten, and NBC is still around. Well, the same thing is going on with McLean in the shipping business, because he comes into the shipping business, which up until then had been divided into all kinds of different silos. There were the people who ran trucks. There were the people who did train freight. There were the people who ran the docks, the Longshoremen's Union, and then there were the people who owned the ships. And each of them managed their own little business independently. But he comes along and he says, you know what? It's actually one business, right? You have to reinvent every single one of those businesses if you're going to bring the freight business into the modern world. So he goes and he talks to manufacturers and he says, you got to ship enough stuff to fill a container, right? You can't just export stuff in small batches. You got to have large batches. And he goes to the truck manufacturers and he says, you have to design trucks that have a common size of a container on the back that we can remove really easily. And then he goes to the docks and he says, you've got to have cranes that are strong enough to lift the container off. The containers are 40,000 pounds, right? There's no crane in the shipping business in 1950 that is strong enough to lift that. He's got to go and find someone and completely rebuild new cranes. He's got to rebuild the piers so they're strong enough to handle the weight of all this additional stuff. He's got to redesign the retrofit ships so they can fit these containers can come in and out. I could go on. He had to go and he had to renegotiate the contracts with every longshoremen's union up and down the coasts of the United States. Why? Because he was putting them out of business, right? And then he has to go and he does all these things and he forms a company called Sealand, which is still around, and he discovers he's still losing money. Why? Because he's got the wrong people. He has to go and fire his sales staff and for the first time bring in college-educated, sophisticated people who understand that their business has changed, that they are managing a supply chain from one customer to another. They are not managing some little piece of some individual piece of the journey. Right? Now, what's fascinating about that process of reinvention and that inversion of the power structure of the industry is that nobody else sees it. He's denounced. People think he's crazy. They're like, you're a rube from North Carolina and you know nothing about ships. You know nothing about the world of moving freight. You know nothing about the regulations, the unions, the conventions, nothing. And you're coming into this world and you mortgage yourself to the hilt to buy a bunch of old freighters. You're committing suicide. He goes to Amsterdam at one point to try and sell his idea to the big European ports, and he is heckled off the stage. He says, "What you're doing is insane. Right? Makes no sense." Right? The people who ran the shipping business at that point in America were these all based in Lower Manhattan, and they were incredibly wealthy companies with a long legacy, and they were headed by people who thought they were inheritors of a 1,000-year tradition of maritime shipping, and they all lunched every day at the Maritime Club and smoked big fat cigars and paid themselves enormous fortunes. And they thought that this guy, Malcolm McLean from North Carolina, was an idiot. And they ignored him. And they said, "You can't change the world the way it is now." Right? And within 20 years, every one of those companies was gone. Right? The revolution was coming and they didn't see it. Well, that is the first, I think, lesson of these kinds of transformations, that when you reimagine a world, when you bring a new paradigm, a new frame for the way people make sense of the relationship between customers and their suppliers, you create a whole ripple effect. You upend the existing nature of relationships in that business. And it makes it really hard for many people to make the transition. People, those shippers, were powerfully invested in the notion of themselves as central to the process. And along came a guy and said, it's not about being a captain of a ship. It's about understanding this is a process that goes from A to B. Second lesson in all of this, and that is that when you do these kinds of reframings, when you reinvent a business like this, it dramatically complicates the kinds of relationships you have with your customers. Now, you know this. You live this. But I think it's really important to see how this has played out in one industry after another. And the example I want to give you is medicine. In particular, the role that urologists have played. I realize it's early in the morning to be talking about urology. Forgive me. And what's going to follow is going to be a little bit squeamish, but that's okay. 40 years ago, if you were a middle-aged man and you were suffering from pain in your hips and spine and blood in your urine, you went to your urologist. He gave you a rectal exam, and if he found a lump on your prostate, he said, "You have prostate cancer. We're taking it out." Right? Now what happens? Well, now what happens is you don't wait for that moment if you're a middle-aged man. You go and get a test, which is for the presence of an antigen, which is associated with an enlarged prostate. It's called a PSA test. If your PSA test is elevated, then the urologist will do a biopsy. They will take little slivers of your prostate. They will analyze them. If they see evidence of cancer, they will recommend a course of treatment, which is either chemotherapy, radiation, surgery, or nothing. That is a radical reinvention of that business. Right? The role of the doctor in the new paradigm is profoundly different from the role of the doctor in the old paradigm. And let me give you a sense of how that world has gotten more difficult. Let's start with the PSA test. PSA tests are graded on a scale of 0 to whatever, 10. We consider a PSA to be abnormal if it is greater than 4. Why do we choose 4 as the number? No particular reason. There's as much cancer associated with a PSA level as 3 as there is with 4. And by the way, lots and lots of men who have a PSA of 5 or 6 don't have cancer. Right? It's a complicated test, in other words. Then there's the question of the biopsy. Normally when you have cancer, you got a lump and they biopsy the lump, right? There's no lump with prostate cancer in this instance. Right, we're getting it, so we're so early. We're so early in the process that the cancer could be anywhere. So what do? Well, you divide the prostate's like a little golf ball. You divide the golf ball into segments, and you take a sliver from each segment, 6 slivers in all. Right? Why do we take 6 slivers? No reason. We could take 12. What happens when you take 12 slivers? You find twice as much cancer as you find when you take 6 slivers. So why don't urologists use 3 as the cutoff point for the PSA and take 12 slivers? they would find more cancer. Yes, they would, right? So why don't they do that? Well, because it's unclear what finding more cancer means. There are 3 kinds of prostate cancer. There's the kind that moves really slowly and will kill you unless you do something. There's the kind that moves really slowly and will never kill you. And there's the kind that moves really quickly and will kill you no matter what you do. Prostate screening is useful only in category 1, right? In category 2, it's actually a really bad idea because the cancer is never going to harm you, so you go to all this trouble and you become incontinent and impotent and you go through this, that, and the other, and whatever, for something that was going to be fine. And then in category 3, it's pointless. You're going to die anyway, right? So what's the ratio of category 1, where this kind of stuff is useful, to category 2 and 3, where it's not? Well, there's way more 2 and 3 than there is 1. Way more. We know this because over the last 50 years, the diagnosis of prostate cancer looks like that, and the death rate from prostate cancer is absolutely flat. The overwhelming majority of the prostate cancer that we find has no consequence. Was never going to kill you, right? So think about what that means for the role of the doctor. All of a sudden, the doctor's role in this particular environment has changed. Used to be that what the urologist was doing was simply collecting information, right? Now he has to analyze information. Used to be that he just made a up or down decision about whether you are or you are not someone who ought to have surgery. Now he actually has to do some work. He's got to figure out, well, what does this PSA mean? Or should I do another one? Should I do 3 or 4? Should I do 6, 8, 12, or 24 slivers? He has to go through the process of explaining the probabilities of this particular disease. Most importantly, he's got to think about you, right? I mean, what do you want to do about your particular risk profile in this instance? So for example, the simplest way of making sense of prostate cancer is that if you're a man, your risk of having it is your age. If you are 40, you have a 40% chance. If you are 80, you have an 80% chance of having prostate cancer. I'm 50. I have a 50% chance right now of having prostate cancer. The question is, does that bother me? The answer is, it doesn't bother me in the slightest. My interpretation of the data is I will never, ever, ever get a PSA test. Makes no sense. If you look at it, we treat 100 men for prostate cancer who would never have any chance of having an ill effect from their disease in exchange for saving 1 life. I see those odds and I say, it's not worth it. Right? Another person might see those odds and say, I absolutely want to be treated. I want to know now and I want to act as aggressively as I can. It's up to the person. That's the single most important transition that the doctor has to make. It used to be the case that a doctor was a urologist was someone who made a transaction with their patient, right? The transaction was over the question of whether I take your prostate out or not. Now the doctor has to have a relationship with the patient. They got to know who you are, what you want, how you feel about what you're doing. They have to have an honest conversation with you. They have to be someone that you trust and know. They have to, more than that, they have to be someone who knows you, who knows enough about you and your needs and emotions and desires and situations to be able to sit down with you and honestly talk about whatever is going on in those nether regions. Right? Well, has the medical profession done a good job of making that transition, of going from a business where all you did was a transaction to going to a business where you have to have a deep and sophisticated understanding of what your customer wants and needs? The answer is no, they have not, right? It's an incredible op-ed in the New York Times not long ago by a guy named Richard Ablin, who is the inventor of the PSA test. And basically he said, I cannot believe what a catastrophe, he used the phrase public health catastrophe has been created by the medical profession over the PSA test. The number of the thousands, tens upon hundreds of thousands of men who have been submitted to medically unnecessary and deleterious treatment through the misuse of this test. He said it was never supposed to be a test that every man was going to take on a regular basis once they hit the age of 50. He said, I developed it for people who had a serious family history of prostate cancer. I wanted to keep an eye on their risk factors. And for people who had already had prostate surgery and were looking for evidence of a recurrence of their cancer. That's all it was supposed to be. But it got turned into this huge multi-billion-dollar business. Why? Because doctors didn't understand that the nature of their business had changed. They hadn't made that transition. They were incapable of having that kind of honest conversation with their customers. Well, that is exactly the transition that everyone in your industry is facing. You've got to go from a transaction model to a relationship model. And it's very easy to talk about, but it's really hard to do. That's what we've learned from all of these previous situations. If you are a doctor, you have to understand that you are in the relationship business. If you are in a shipper, you have to understand that what you are interested in is the supply chain from A to B, not in managing some transaction along the way. If you're in the radio business, you have to understand that you are not selling a box, you are selling an experience. Right? Those are the rules of the modern economy. And those who grasp those rules are the ones who thrive and succeed and are capable of transforming the industries that they're a part. Thank you very much.